Who are this new elite that are influencing our way of life and the national conversation? Because they're not elected, are they?
Not always. What I'm doing in this book, Mark, is pointing to the rise of a new middle-class graduate elite, people who tend to come from affluent families whose parents often belong to the managerial professional class, who tend to live in the big cities, the university towns, and crucially, unlike the old elite, Mark, they tend to lean very strongly to the left on cultural issues like immigration, sex, gender, diversity, and so on. And within that group, Mark, I point specifically to a sort of smaller group called the radical progressives, who represent about 15% of Britain. They're disproportionately dominant in the institutions, the creative industries, advertising, marketing, to some extent politics, and they're really out of touch with the rest of the country on a whole host of issues like how we think about our history, our identity. And that group has been most strong and loud in its opposition to the book, I think, because they really don't like the mirror being held up to them. So it's been an interesting few weeks, which of course began in a conversation on this show, I remember, a few weeks ago.
Indeed so. I've got to admit, I'm watched with great amusement as well-paid, influential radio presenters and journalists, the likes of James O'Brien on LBC, Alistair Campbell, furiously criticising your book, attacking you in quite a personal way. The elite didn't like your book about the elite.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think because members of the new elite like to think of themselves as the oppressed underdogs, the people who are fighting the system, they're fighting the old elite, and they don't like to think that they have an enormous amount of political and cultural power themselves. Alistair Campbell's a great example of this, somebody who does wield considerable influence over the national conversation, but who would instantly deny that he's having any influence at all, because in his eyes it's all about opposing Brexit, opposing the Tories. And what I'm saying here, Mark, is that actually if we think about who has access to not just political power, but cultural power, social power, who defines the issues that we're allowed to talk about, who talks about the rest of society. My argument here is that I think millions of people, including those watching this show, feel that they're not in the national conversation. And if they are, they're certainly not respected. Maybe Brexit voters feel that they were ridiculed for years. Maybe Conservatives feel like their concerns over immigration and the borders aren't taken as seriously as the concerns that Liberals have over issues like opposing Rwanda, for example. And I think these value divides have become enormous today. And really, that's why I wrote the book, because I think many people sense that actually their view of the world is not being sufficiently represented.
And I know you've had lots of people writing to you in hushed tones saying, I work for a corporation, I work for a local authority, and we agree with everything that you've written, but we just can't say it publicly. Do you think this powerful new elite will hang on to their influence for the foreseeable future?
Well, it's interesting, Mark. Some of the people who have written to me confidentially, we're not talking even about, ordinary folks on the street even. I'm talking about top-level senior servants, directors of major FTSE 100 companies, human resources directors, people who have all said, look, you're onto something here. The orthodoxy has become stifling. I can't say what I want to say. I'm being forced to embrace a set of values that I don't share. 60% of the country, Mark, now feel they can't say what they really want to say in wider society. So this is a really big issue. I think the new elite are being forced, as we saw with Brexit, as we saw with the 2019 election, they're being forced to really give up and give away some of their power, and they're not reacting well to that. They've doubled down on their own group. I think partly that's why we have GB News, that's why we have this new media ecosystem, is because this group has done a very bad job, actually, of opening up the national conversation. So I think, there are more people out there who want to look at alternative conversations, alternative media. And I think if you look globally, Mark, look, these rebellions have gone nowhere. Look at France, look at Italy, look at Sweden, look at the US next year with the presidential election. I've been saying now for 10 years, people are completely disconnected from the mainstream parties and they're looking for something different. And the new elite have been very hostile in their response to that. Their standard operation, Mark, is to denounce and stigmatize anybody who challenges them as being a sort of, a crank, a contrarian, someone who is not somehow socially acceptable. But we're talking about millions of people, right? As you know, millions of people who say, I don't share this consensus.
So earlier this year, Rishi Sunak pledged to scrap 4,000 European Union laws by the end of the year. However, this week, Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch said that only 20% of those laws, just 800, were likely to be scrapped by December 31st. So the question is this a betrayal of Brexit? To discuss this, let's head to the United States and to the co-founder of Vote Leave, former Conservative Party and UKIP MP, Douglas Carswell. Douglas, thanks very much for joining us tonight. So maybe you can answer that question. Is it a betrayal?
I think Brexit is being betrayed. Ever since the majority of people in Britain voted to leave the European Union, the political establishment, first of all, wouldn't accept the result. We had to have a series of elections for them to honour the referendum result. Now we have a government that pays lip service to Brexit, but they're doing nothing to take advantage of the opportunities of Brexit. Here you have an example of 4,000 EU rules, which we were required to follow when we were in the EU. We were promised that we were going to review and remove them, and yet we now hear that 80% of them are going to be retained. Why are they going to be retained? Because the Minister, Kemi Badenoch, who incidentally I used to think was one of the good guys in this, the Minister, Kemi Badenoch, has been told by her civil servants that they don't want to get rid of them. Well, excuse me, is this government run by a Brussels-loving bureaucracy or by Conservative ministers that we voted for to deliver on Brexit? I'm afraid to say I don't think this government is doing really that much at all to take advantage of the opportunities of Brexit. If anything, actually, this government is making things worse. It is gold-plating rules, creating more regulation, and ensuring that Britain is no longer a good place to do business. It is a tragedy.
So you raise a number of points there, Douglas, but I want to pick you up on this point about the civil service. Is it the case that the civil service is just completely enamoured by EU red tape to the extent that they're going to interfere? Aren't the civil service supposed to be politically neutral? And if they're not, why is it not the case that the government isn't doing anything about that?
The British civil service is absolutely not neutral. They will pay lip service to the fact that they don't get involved in party politics, but they have very clear preferences. And their preferences is always in favour of regulation. The idea that we should somehow deregulate is anathema to them. It's some years since there was that very famous comedy, Yes, Minister. And that was a comedy that showed the tension between a minister and a civil servant, with the civil servant invariably getting his way. It's not a joke anymore. This is how government is run. You have a minister coming in to their department, and they are encased in this bureaucracy that simply doesn't give them the opportunities and the options to do anything that the bureaucracy doesn't want. Now, it takes a pretty exceptional kind of minister to have the resources and the ability to cut through that. Imagine if you were running a government department that employed 10, 20, 30,000 people. You don't have the ability to hire and fire a single one. If, like Dominic Raab, you try to use a bit of robust persuasion to get the civil servants to do what you ask them, they can undermine you and get you sacked, which is exactly what happened. In effect, ministers are simply the mouthpiece of the permanent bureaucracy. And it is the permanent bureaucracy that is running this country, that is making, I think, some catastrophic policy errors. And one of those real errors is a failure to take advantage of the opportunities that Brexit was supposed to be all about.
Can I ask you specifically about this question of laws and EU regulations? Notoriously, they're very difficult to pinpoint in terms of how many of our laws originate in the EU. Some experts put it as high as 62%, others as low as 13%. No one seems to know what these laws are. Can you explain why it's important that we get these laws off our statute books?
I'll give you a specific example of the so-called GDPR, the data protection regulations. We signed up to those when we were in the EU, basically because a German apparatchik in Brussels wanted to impose German regulations on the rest of Europe. As a consequence of doing so, anyone who complies with GDPR regulation is now falling dramatically behind some of the tech innovation that is now happening around the world. I'm talking to you from the United States, where we don't have GDPR. One of the great advantages of not having GDPR, it allows small retailers to take advantage of some of the marketing tools that social media platforms and the opportunities that they offer, and allows them to compete with big players in pretty much any field. In Europe, small operators can't do this. The rules are rigged in favour of big corporations and big corporate online marketing. Now, we should have got rid of GDPR rules. If we did that, it would help small businesses, it would help the little guy, it would help the local independent florist or whatever it is compete against the big corporations. Not getting rid of these rules means that Europe as a whole, and Britain, because it's aligned with these regulations, is simply not growing. The European Union and Britain...
That's a very important point that you raise about the pro-corporate nature of the EU, and a lot of the time I think that discussion isn't really being had. I know you've written in your book, Rebel, about this, the way in which corporations, lobby the EU at the detriment to smaller businesses. But is that something that you think people just aren't aware of?
Absolutely. I mean, Brussels is basically a nexus between big business interests and bureaucracy, and they love working together because bureaucracy is used by big businesses to rig the rules. Leaving the EU meant we were supposed to change this and deal with it. It's really depressing to see a so-called conservative administration carry on doing what we would pretty much do if we were in the European Union, failing to take advantage of the opportunities, and then somehow pretending that they're delivering on Brexit. They're simply not.
But it would seem to me that every Conservative Prime Minister, and there's been a few since Brexit now, they've all treated Brexit as really a case of damage limitation, rather than trying to find the opportunity. Would you say that's right?
I would. I mean, I remember in the run-up to the referendum campaign being sort of in the bunker, the vote leave bunker. And there weren't many people around. And I certainly can't remember many of the current cabinet who now claim that somehow they are Brexit champions. I think many of them fundamentally, from Theresa May onwards, haven't really understood the point of Brexit. They think it's all about being rude about foreigners. They think it's all about, controlling immigration, not that they've even managed to do that. But, ministers talk about controlling the English Channel. They can't even control their own departments. We see with what happened to Dominic Raab, the civil service is in control. Britain is never going to get its act together until we have a Conservative administration that comes in and treats the permanent mandarinate in Britain the way Margaret Thatcher treated the National Union of Miners. Unless we take on this vested interest in Whitehall and defeat it, Britain will always be governed by mediocrity.
Douglas Carswell, thanks very much for joining me.